This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality. The Floressas Des Esseintes, to judge by the various portraits preserved in the Château de Lourps, had originally been a family of stalwart troopers and stern cavalrymen. Closely arrayed side by side in the old frames which their broad shoulders filled, they startled one with the fixed gaze of their eyes, their fierce moustaches and the chests whose deep curves filled the enormous shells of their cuirasses. These were the ancestors. There were no portraits of their descendants, and a wide breach existed in the series of the faces of this race. Only one painting served as a link to connect the past and present. A crafty, mysterious head with haggard and gaunt features, cheekbones punctuated with a comma of paint, the hair overspread with pearls, a painted neck rising stiffly from the fluted ruff. In this representation of one of the most intimate friends of the Duc d'Epernon and the Marquis d'O, the ravages of a sluggish and impoverished constitution were already noticeable. It was obvious that the decadence of this family had followed an unvarying course. The effemination of the males had continued with quickened tempo. As if to conclude the work of long years, the Des Esseintes had intermarried for 2 centuries, using up in such consanguineous unions such strength as remained. There was only one living scion of this family which had once been so numerous that it had occupied all the territories of the Ile-de-France and La Brie. The Duc Jean was a slender, nervous young man of 30, with hollow cheeks, cold steel-blue eyes, a straight thin nose and delicate hands. By a singular atavistic reversion, the last descendant resembled the old grandsire, from whom he had inherited the pointed, remarkably fair beard and an ambiguous expression, at once weary and cunning. His childhood had been an unhappy one. Menaced with scrofula and afflicted with relentless fevers, he yet succeeded in crossing the breakers of adolescence, thanks to fresh air and careful attention. He grew stronger, overcame the languors of chlorosis, and reached his full development. His mother, a tall, pale, taciturn woman, died of anemia, and his father of some uncertain malady. Des Esseintes was then 17 years of age. He retained but a vague memory of his parents, and felt neither affection nor gratitude for them. He hardly knew his father, who usually resided in Paris. He recalled his mother as she lay motionless in a dim room of the Château de Lourps. The husband and wife would meet on rare occasions, and he remembered those lifeless interviews when his parents sat face to face in front of a round table, faintly lit by a lamp with a wide, low-hanging shade. For the Duchesse could not endure light or sound without being seized with a fit of nervousness. A few halting words would be exchanged between them in the gloom, and then the indifferent Duke would depart to meet the first train back to Paris. Jean's life at the Jesuit school where he was sent to study was more pleasant. At first the fathers pampered the lad whose intelligence astonished them, but despite their efforts, they could not induce him to concentrate on studies requiring discipline. He nibbled at various books and was precociously brilliant in Latin. On the contrary, he was absolutely incapable of construing 2 Greek words, showed no aptitude for living languages, and promptly proved himself a dunce when obliged to master the elements of the sciences. His family gave him little heed. Sometimes his father visited him at school. "How are you? Be good. Study hard." And he was gone. The lad passed the summer vacations at the Château de Lourps, but his presence could not seduce his mother from her reveries. She scarcely noticed him. When she did, her gaze would rest on him for a moment with a sad smile. And that was all. The moment after, she would again become absorbed in the artificial night with which the heavily curtained windows enshrouded the room. The servants were old and dull. Left to himself, the boy delved into books on rainy days and roamed the countryside on pleasant afternoons. It was his supreme delight to wander down the little valley to Jutigny, a village planted at the foot of the hills. A tiny heap of cottages, capped with thatch, strewn with tufts of sengreen and clumps of moss. In the open fields, under the shadow of high ricks, he would lie, listening to the hollow splashing of the mills and inhaling the fresh breeze from Voulzy. Sometimes he went as far as the peat bogs, to the green and black hamlet of Longueville, or climbed wind-swept hillsides affording magnificent views. There below, to one side, as far as the eye could reach, lay the Seine Valley, blending in the distance with the blue sky. High up, near the horizon, on the other side, rose the churches and tower of Provins, which seemed to tremble in the golden dust of the air. Immersed in solitude, he would dream or read far into the night. By protracted contemplation of the same thoughts, his mind grew sharp. His vague, undeveloped ideas took on form. After each vacation, Jean returned to his masters more reflective and headstrong. These changes did not escape them. Subtle and observant, accustomed by their profession to plumb souls to their depths, they were fully aware of his unresponsiveness to their teachings. They knew that this student would never contribute to the glory of their order, and as his family was rich and apparently careless of his future, they soon renounced the idea of having him take up any of the professions their school offered. Although he willingly discussed with them those theological doctrines which intrigued his fancy by their subtleties and hair-splittings, they did not even think of training him for the religious orders, since, in spite of their efforts, his faith remained languid. As a last resort, through prudence and fear of the harm he might effect, they permitted him to pursue whatever studies pleased him, and to neglect the others, being loath to antagonize this bold and independent spirit by the quibblings of the lay school assistants. Thus he lived in perfect contentment, scarcely feeling the parental yoke of the priests. He continued his Latin and French studies when the whim seized him, and, although theology did not figure in his schedule, he finished his apprenticeship in this science, begun at the Château de Lourps, in the library bequeathed by his grand-uncle, Dom Prosper, the old prior of the regular canons of Saint-Ruf. But soon the time came when he must quit the Jesuit institution. He attained his majority and became master of his fortune. The Comte de Montchevrel, his cousin and guardian, placed in his hands the title to his wealth. There was no intimacy between them, for there was no possible point of contact between these two men, the one young, the other old. Impelled by curiosity, idleness or politeness, Des Esseintes sometimes visited the Montchevrel family and spent some dull evenings in their Rue de la Chaise mansion, where the ladies, old as antiquity itself, would gossip of quarterings of the noble arms, heraldic moons and anachronistic ceremonies. The men, gathered around whist tables, proved even more shallow and insignificant than the dowagers. These descendants of ancient, courageous knights, these last branches of feudal races, appeared to Des Esseintes as catarrhal, crazy old men repeating inanities and time-worn phrases. A fleur-de-lis seemed the sole imprint on the soft pap of their brains. The youth felt an unutterable pity for these mummies, buried in their elaborate hypogeums of wainscoting and grotto work, for these tedious triflers whose eyes were forever turned towards a hazy Canaan, an imaginary Palestine. After a few visits with such relatives, he resolved never again to set foot in their homes, regardless of invitations or reproaches. Then he began to seek out the young men of his own age and set. One group, educated like himself in religious institutions, preserved the special marks of this training. They attended religious services, received the sacrament on Easter, frequented the Catholic circles, and concealed as criminal their amorous escapades. For the most part, they were unintelligent, acquiescent fops, stupid boors who had tried the patience of their professors. Yet these professors were pleased to have bestowed such docile, pious creatures upon society. The other group, educated in the state colleges or in the lycées, were less hypocritical and much more courageous, but they were neither more interesting nor less bigoted. gay young men dazzled by operettas and races. They played lansquenet and baccarat, staked large fortunes on horses and cards, and cultivated all the pleasures enchanting to brainless fools. After a year's experience, Des Esseintes felt an overpowering weariness of this company, whose debaucheries seemed to him so unrefined, facile and indiscriminate, without any ardent reactions or excitement of nerves and blood. He gradually forsook them to make the acquaintance of literary men, in whom he thought he might find more interest and feel more at ease. This too proved disappointing. He was revolted by their rancorous and petty judgments, their conversation as obvious as a church door, their dreary discussions in which they judged the value of a book by the number of editions it had passed and by the profits acquired. At the same time, he noticed that the free thinkers, the doctrinaires of the bourgeoisie, people who claimed every liberty that they might stifle the opinions of others, were greedy and shameless Puritans, whom, in education, he esteemed inferior to the corner shoemaker. His contempt for humanity deepened. He reached the conclusion that the world, for the most part, was composed of scoundrels and imbeciles. Certainly, he could not hope to discover in others aspirations and aversions similar to his own, could not expect companionship with an intelligence exulting in a studious decrepitude, nor anticipate meeting a mind as keen as his among the writers and scholars. Irritated, ill at ease, and offended by the poverty of ideas given and received, he became like those people described by Nicole, those who are always melancholy. He would fly into a rage when he read the patriotic and social balderdash retailed daily in the newspapers, and would exaggerate the significance of the plaudits which a sovereign public always reserves for works deficient in ideas and style. Already he was dreaming of a refined solitude, a comfortable desert, a motionless ark in which to seek refuge from the unending deluge of human stupidity. A single passion, woman, might have curbed his contempt, but that too had palled on him. He had taken to carnal repasts with the eagerness of a crotchety man affected with a depraved appetite and given to sudden hungers, whose taste is quickly dulled and surfeited. Associating with country squires, he had taken part in their lavish suppers, where at dessert, tipsy women would unfasten their clothing and strike their heads against the tables. He had haunted the green rooms, loved actresses and singers, endured, in addition to the natural stupidity he had come to expect of women, the maddening vanity of female strolling players. Finally, satiated and weary of this monotonous extravagance and the sameness of their caresses, he had plunged into the foul depths, hoping by contrast of squalid misery to revive his desires and stimulate his deadened senses. Whatever he attempted proved vain. An unconquerable ennui oppressed him. Yet he persisted in his excesses and returned to the perilous embrace of accomplished mistresses. But his health failed, his nervous system collapsed, the back of his neck grew sensitive, his hand, still firm when it seized a heavy object, trembled when it held a tiny glass. The physicians whom he consulted frightened him. It was high time to check his excesses and renounce those pursuits which were dissipating his reserve of strength. For a while he was at peace, but his brain soon became overexcited. Like those young girls who, in the grip of puberty, crave coarse and vile foods, he dreamed of and practiced perverse loves and pleasures. This was the end. As though satisfied with having exhausted everything, as though completely surrendering to fatigue, his senses fell into a lethargy, and impotence threatened him. He recovered, but he was lonely, tired, sobered, imploring an end to his life, which the cowardice of his flesh prevented him from consummating. Once more he was toying with the idea of becoming a recluse, of living in some hushed retreat where the turmoil of life would be muffled, as in those streets covered with straw to prevent any sound from reaching invalids. It was time to make up his mind. The condition of his finances terrified him. He had spent, in acts of folly and in drinking bouts, the greater part of his patrimony, and the remainder, invested in land, produced a ridiculously small income. He decided to sell the Château de Lourps, which he no longer visited, and where he left no memory or regret behind. He liquidated his other holdings, bought government bonds, and in this way drew an annual interest of 50,000 francs. In addition, he reserved a sum of money which he meant to use in buying and furnishing the house where he proposed to enjoy a perfect repose. Exploring the suburbs of the capital, he found a place for sale at the top of Fontenay-aux-Roses, in a secluded section near the fort, far from any neighbours. His dream was realised. In this little country place, so little violated by Parisians, he could be certain of seclusion. The difficulty of reaching the place, due to an unreliable railroad passing by at the end of the town, and to the little streetcars which came and went at irregular intervals, reassured him. He could picture himself alone on the bluff, sufficiently far away to prevent the Parisian throngs from reaching him, and yet near enough to the capital to confirm him in his solitude. And he felt that in not entirely closing the way, there was a chance that he would not be assailed by a wish to return to society, seeing that it is only the impossible, the unachievable, that arouses desire. He put masons to work on the house he had acquired. Then, one day, informing no one of his plans, he quickly disposed of his old furniture, dismissed his servants, and left, without giving the concierge any address. That was the first chapter of an English translation of the novel À rebours by J.K. Huysmans, and, as you may have gathered, read by me. Well, as I just said, that was the first chapter of Joris-Karl Huysmans' novel À rebours. It's from the English translation by John Howard, which was published in America by Lever and Lewis in 1922, under the title Against the Grain. I first read this book in a later translation called Against Nature, which I prefer. But Against the Grain is in public domain, and Against Nature isn't, so...
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is.
It's interesting how often lately we're featuring books from the apparently vast reservoir of interesting Victorian literature, known and unknown.
Yeah, we have been featuring quite a few of those. I love the language of that era. It has a rich, spacious sensibility. It isn't rushed.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's because it's from a pre-digital age and time hadn't been divided into nanoseconds.
Yeah.
I think the lavish descriptions of Des Esseintes' hyper-aesthetic excesses are fantastic. There's something both horrific and amusing about them. I also find the book historically interesting in a broader sense. There'd been 100 years of relative peace in Europe, and it was veering towards the First World War, its culmination. The word decadence means deterioration and moral decay, so that fin de siècle period was a kind of pivot point. That's the way I see it.
That makes sense. I can't say I know much at all about European history. In terms of literary movements, I understand that Huysmans had been in the naturalism school, but grew disillusioned with gritty stories of working people and decided to do something different. A book about a decadent aristocrat.
Aurébord was published in 1884. Apparently he didn't expect it to do well, but it turned out causing quite a stir. It's been called the Guidebook of Decadence and is said to have been an influence on Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray.
Yes, the title page of the 1926 English edition says as much, and I like the subtitle of that edition. A novel without a plot, it says in large type. It reminded me of David Markson's late work, a concerted effort to step outside the conventions of novel writing.
Yeah, it doesn't really have a plot in a traditional sense. It just centers on Jean des Esseintes, a sickly, neurotic aristocrat who spends his time alone contemplating his paintings, thinking about literature and religious mysteries, and indulging his high-strung sensibilities with perfumes and jewels, while reminiscing about past debaucheries and love affairs. He even creates a garden of poisonous flowers.
And speaking of poisonous, that's also the word Oscar Wilde uses in The Picture of Dorian Gray. Without naming Huysmans' book, he has his character Lord Henry give Dorian a, quote, poisonous French novel, end quote, which starts young Dorian on his road to corruption. Wilde purposely gave inaccurate references to chapters in the book, but basically admitted the source in his 1895 trial for indecency.
Well, Émile Zola was apparently upset about Aurébord. Maybe he saw it as a betrayal. He'd admired Huysmans' work in the naturalist vein and had helped him quite a bit. I think it was Zola's literary theories which formed the basis of naturalism. It was a style that embraced determinism, objectivism, and detachment, as if a story was a scientific experiment and the characters were the phenomena being studied. Naturalists wrote realistic fiction, often as social commentary, and eschewed romanticism.
Sort of corresponding to the Ashcan school of American art, perhaps.
Maybe. Not that I know much about that. But Aurébord was a big departure from naturalism, and I don't think Zola ever forgave him. Apparently, Huysmans warned him in a letter that he was changing his writing style.
You gotta move on from your mentors if you want to be true to yourself.
Yeah.
Bob Dylan left Woody Guthrie's style of music behind. Some people hate you for it, others love you. So it goes. The waves of style in the arts just keep on coming.
Yeah. Romanticism was superseded by naturalism, which was in turn superseded by decadence and symbolism. Though they all coexisted. It's quite hard to separate decadence and symbolism. For me, at any rate, they share some common ground. Decadence, at least, valued the artificial over the natural, and eventually veered off in a more nihilistic direction.
Yeah.
Being concerned mostly with personal gratification and pleasure, above all else, the more perverse, the better. Huysmans disassociated himself from it.
I can't say I've read much in the decadence realm, but I liked The Picture of Dorian Gray a lot.
Yeah, it was an interesting time. There was a symbolist author known as Rothschild. She held soirees every Tuesday and was involved with the avant-garde literary magazine Mercure de France, founded by her husband, Alfred Viette. She wrote numerous articles and reviews and helped budding authors and was an important figure in the Parisian literary scene. She also wrote a number of plays and novels which were considered scandalous at the time. She was even sentenced to prison in absentia in Belgium for pornography. She claimed that some of the more salubrious parts of her novel, Monsieur Venus, were written by a man, of whom no trace was ever found. Perhaps it was a way to avoid personal liability. The censor was ever present in those days. Let's hope he doesn't return.
Well, I would say we certainly have no absence of the censor in recent years, but usually not regarding artistic expression or in the realm of politics, which we don't talk about here. But I like Rothschild's idea of claiming her book was not written by her. Sort of sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It raises our frequent question, where's the boundary between fiction and reality?
Where indeed. Des Esseintes was apparently partly based on a real person, the aristocrat and aesthete Robert de Montesquieu, his full name being Marie-Joseph Robert Anatole, Comte de Montesquieu-Fezensac.
Wow.
He was a symbolist poet, painter, art collector, and dandy. Another interesting character who we probably can't delve into here, other than to say that he wanted to be the world's most photographed person.
I want to be the world's least photographed person.
Well, those were the days before surveillance cameras. Huysmans seems to have been a pessimist and shared some of Des Esseintes' sensibilities. He was very taken with Schopenhauer's philosophy because of what he regarded as its pessimism. I wonder if he was as misogynistic as Des Esseintes.
As if pessimism and nihilism are somehow freeing. And decadence and misogyny don't really seem to go together, but what do I know?
Yes, another tricky question. Well, Huysmans, aside from being a novelist, was also an art critic. He's credited with discovering the Impressionists. He worked as a civil servant for 32 years, and after that he was able to support himself with the royalties from his book, La Cathédrale. He reconverted or re-embraced Catholicism in later life, after having abandoned it as a child.
People are full of surprises.
So they are. By the way, J.K. or Joris-Karl Huysmans was a pen name. His real name was Charles-Marie Georges Huysmans.
Well, that changes everything.
Yeah, I think it does. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was an excerpt of Gnossienne 1 by Eric Satie, an Abydos music recording. This is episode 25041.